Young Bird, take it away, championship song.
The treaty was signed in 1874, and the area that is set out now comprises some 1,300 acres right now. If some of you are familiar with Fort Qu'Appelle, it stems from, I don't know if you know where the Kentucky Fried Chicken House is back here, but it stems from that street, I think it's called Boundary Avenue, over to the east, up to the lakes, then to the back to the ski resort. All that land was the area designated as a treaty reserve, special reserve. In 1878-79, the Indian chiefs and the leaders, when they came down to meet for their annuity payments, they noticed that there were a lot of settlers and half-breeds starting to settle on this special treaty reserve. The reserve was promised to them as a place where they would always come and meet to get their annuity payments, to discuss the treaty and the progressions that were made in regards to it. But a lot of the chiefs back then became alarmed. There were a lot of people settling on it, right on the treaty area, right on the special treaty reserve. And they wanted assurances from the Indian Commissioner at that time that that would no longer happen. In 1881, when it came time for the annuity payments again, Chief Payapot protested to the Commissioner at that time about the settlers encroaching on their special reserve, the land that was set out for them based on treaty. And there's an interesting quotation that I want to read out here. Basically, it's coming from the Commissioner at the time too, was Dudney, and he's writing a letter to the people in Ottawa. It reads, "On August 17th, I had a council with Payapot. He wished me to meet him where he had placed his flag, but I advised him to come to the Indian office about a quarter of a mile from the flag. In his speech to me, he said, 'Where I have the flag, that is the land promised for the treaty, and that is where I want to get my money. Now why did you not let me know about that the white man was settling all in the bottom here?' And before the Commissioner could even get a chance to reply, Payapot just strode away because he's terribly upset at the breach of treaty. On May 8th, 1894, since the annuity payments were no longer set up here on the treaty reserve, action was taken by Mr. Hayter Reed, Deputy Superintendent General of INAC, to dispose of the land. Basically, he sent a memo stating that Since the land is no longer needed for the annuity payments and discussions of treaty, because all the Indian people are getting paid back on their reserves, there's no longer a need for the special treaty land.
My friends from Little Black Bear First Nation, I bring you greetings, and from Treaty 4 territory. Just a few words here. This is a treaty gathering, a treaty powwow, and we always acknowledge our tribes throughout this territory, the Denisant-Nene in the north, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota tribes, of course, the Nehiyawak, and the Anishinaabe. And we always say, as Indigenous peoples, we have our own land, our own languages, our own laws, our own territory, our own populations. And we exercise that inherent right to make a treaty with that crown and right of Great Britain. And we grow up listening to these words that nations make treaties, treaties do not make nations. And we said it's to be on peaceful coexistence and mutual respect with our white brothers and sisters. And we still have to carry that forward. We are all treaty people sharing this land. And yet we have much to do to see that treaty honored and implemented according to that spirit and intent. One of the things we're working on, our old people always say we're shared the depth of a plow with our white brothers and sisters. Only the depth of a plow. We still have to see that magigway underneath that. And so we have to work on that. Resource sharing. Resource sharing, because that's how we're talking about it now in Treaty 4 territory. And we've always said we look at a political strategy, a legal strategy, an on-the-ground civil activist strategy if we have to. We're looking at it on a legal way to deal with that. So when we come together as treaty people, we can say we dealt with that. Because we keep talking, but we're not moving forward. We have to move forward now, and that's how we look at it. So my friends, my relatives, the last point I want to make, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge this point about government has yet to respect and honor that treaty. Government has yet to see that treaty honored according to spirit and intent, because what they've done now, we no longer have a Minister of Indian Affairs. We have a Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. That's not right. That's not respect. That's not the way it should be. It takes away from that relationship with that crown. It takes away from that. And we put into that mixing bowl with all of our other peoples. It takes away from that. So we have to be louder. We have to be vigilant. We have to be stronger when we want to change that now. That's the way we have to keep going forward. And I also want to say, by our dancers and our singers and our lodges, we have to keep going back to them and put those first. As Indigenous peoples, that's how we're going to get stronger, because there is freedom from alcohol and drugs amongst our people through these ceremonies, and that's the way we will provide hope for our young children and grandchildren and those yet to come. So my friends, my relatives, enjoy the rest of the powwow. Hi, hi.
Wild eyes, I can't look away from your wild eyes. Why were treaties struck in the first place? Why were treaties made in the first place? They were made for a simple reason that the Crown, the sovereign, recognized that they did not have title to the land, that the title remained with the Indian nations of Canada. That's who had the title. Now, in order for the Crown or the sovereign to settle the land, they had to have access to this title. They had to gain title to the land. And the only way they could do that was through treaties. In order to get the Indian people to agree to sign the treaty, in order to get them to agree to sign their X on the dotted line, so to speak, they were given the assurances that, quote and unquote, you would not be subject to any imposition of any tax, nor enforced military service. That's in the Treaty Commissioner's report to Ottawa. Now, it's written down there, and it's verbally talked about through all the number of treaties. The elders will make reference to it. That was one of the promises. No tax, no enforced military service. We will not have to do that. We will not have to pay that. We will not have to endure that. But then along comes a GST. No, it's a federal tax on everybody, including treaty Indian people, which goes against our understanding of treaty.
We recognize that our treaties have been breached many, many times, and we recognize that our treaties aren't being fulfilled according to the spirit and intent and according to the way that they were made for us. We know that, our elders know that, and we know that.
Our understanding of what was surrendered was this, the topsoil. Because we recognize as Indian people that the Europeans wanted to farm it. So that's part of the negotiations. That's part of the agreements. That's not in the treaty, but it was talked about, and it was verbally agreed to. So when we talk about the sharing of the land, when we talk about what was surrendered, that's all that was surrendered. The right to come in and use the topsoil to farm and settle it. That's what was surrendered.
You have a valid claim now, after we were told no twice. This land we're on. Treaty 4 Grounds Reserve number 77.
We do, as Aboriginal First Nations, have a special relationship with the Crown. We do indeed have treaty rights. And they're here for as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows. They will not be terminated. They cannot, there is no end to that. They are here forever. And people have to realize and understand that.
There is no better way to promote and protect our rights than through an education and awareness, not only for Indian people, for our non-Indian brothers and sisters, so we can go on and peacefully coexist, but with mutual respect and mutual recognition that these rights are not something that can be done away with at a whim of the government.
You didn't pick up a rifle. You didn't pick up guns. But all you did was talk, to begin to understand one another. You've done lots. Thank you very much. Yeah. You've done it for all of us, for children yet unborn.
Again, as a regional chief, responsibility with the portfolio holder for treaties and treaty implementation, we've brought together our elders and our spiritual people last number of days and treaty chiefs from across Turtle Island. And that was the biggest gathering to focus on this meeting upcoming. And we focused on three things that brought together our people. We held up and acknowledged the Idle No More movement, because that focused on Bill C-38 and Bill C-45, which had a negative impact on lands, resources, and waters in our territories and Mother Earth. So we acknowledge that. That brought things together. We acknowledge, as National Chief said, the people that are on that fast, and that spiritual fast. That's a movement. That's a spiritual thing there in itself. So we held them up because it brought our people together. Unifying rallies involving leadership across Turtle Island, we held that up. The elders, the youth, the women, leadership collectively together, bringing about transformational change. We see that happening. So as treaty leadership met, we talked about one of the most fundamental and important relationships is the relationship with the Crown. And of course that sanctity of contract, the sacredness of that agreement. And so we talked about treaty implementation, treaty enforcement. That's that at a highest level to look at that now, because the treaties were about peaceful coexistence and sharing the lands and resources, not exploitation. Our treaties were not meant to make us poor in our own homelands, but that's what we see. And so you see that movement because our people were tired of the overcrowded and housing conditions that are there. They're tired of the high unemployment. They're tired of lands and resources being exploited with no involvement from Indigenous peoples. That's what you see happening. And so now, time for a renewal of that relationship with the Crown. The integrity of the Crown has been tarnished many, many times. And so to renew that at a very high level with a commitment from the Prime Minister's office, Privy Council office, new institutions to look at treaty implementation, treaty enforcement, a long-term process, because we recognize the meeting on Friday is just one day. There has to be a high-level commitment ongoing. The second point we talked about is, again, lands and resources being unilaterally developed without our involvement creates poverty. That's not good for this country. We need to deal with that. Get Indigenous peoples involved now. And so we talked about resource revenue sharing, but at a high level, possibly led by one of the ministers involved with natural resources, Mr. Oliver, led by and facilitating meetings with the premiers across Canada. Ongoing processes. We talked about implementation, cabinet mandate for implementation of treaties and inherent rights. We talked about that. 3 high-level commitments that we need to see. Fundamental change, transformational change. We've also talked about where we need to go in terms of dealing with a new fiscal relationship with the Crown, because we've talked about that cap that's been there for 19 years that does not keep up with inflation, that does not meet the needs of our people in our territories. It's not based on total population on and off the reserve. And so we talked about a new fiscal relationship with the Crown. That's important to see, direction to review that. That's not acceptable because we're not even at the starting gate when it comes to fiscal relationships. That was talked about. And then now we need to focus even on some short-term things. We brought up even the missing murdered Aboriginal women in Canada, the call for that inquiry. So these things we've talked about because there's so much injustice, and it really means high-level transformational change, and that's what we need to see as Indigenous peoples. And we've talked about that implementation for each treaty by each treaty territory, and each treaty relationship with the Crown should be looked at nation to nation again. And so that's where we need to take it. And again, that's where on the high level, on the treaty side, the inherent rights side, is what we've talked about, and that's what we're looking for. It's transformational change, and that's what we need to do collectively across this country together. And we're not meant to be poor in our own homelands, and so we need to change that, because we have raised this within the United Nations. They're not just fundamental treaty inherent rights, they're human rights. And dealing with human rights is in the national best interest for all Canadians, and that has to be respected and followed and recognized. And even dealing with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that always speaks to free, prior, and informed consent as it deals with lands and resources. That's where we need to look and need to go.
No, I just had a comment on terms of the education. And in Saskatchewan, I'll hold up that treaties and inherent rights are taught in every school in Saskatchewan, right from kindergarten to grade 12. That's a model that every school in Canada should look after and envision, so our children can grow up with peaceful coexistence, mutual respect, and understanding that there are Indigenous peoples. We have our own land, our own laws, our own culture, all different nations. The National Chief spoke about 58 different nations or tribes in this Turtle Island. And to teach that in the schools, and I say this, the myth that Canada was founded on 2 founding nations, France and Great Britain. Our nations were here, but we say that in a respectful way because we open up our territories to our brothers and sisters to come and work and live in peace together. That should be in every school across Canada. It's happening in our territory, but build upon that, because our futures are intertwined together, and finding that collectivity to close that huge socioeconomic gap that exists. And that's where we have to put our minds and hearts together, done regionally, nationally, internationally. And that's where Canada always gets a black eye, because it's a rich country, but why is one segment, the First Nation people, so poor? And we got to close that collectively together. To make it clear, we do need
the relationship with the Crown, with the Queen is always a paramount for us treaty First Nations people. It was a relationship with the Crown and Right of Great Britain, now with the Patriots from the Constitution 1982, the Crown and Right of Canada. So we hold up high that relationship with the Queen, and so to have the Governor General there, and we're working very hard. We're hoping that it comes in the morning. That meeting will be there, and we're hoping that our chiefs, and Chief Spence will be there to meet with the Governor General, and we're hoping at the Delta. So we're hoping that it happens. We're hoping that it happens, and we're going to keep pressing for that because that's very fundamental. That our relationship with the Crown and rebuilding that relationship nation to nation is fundamental and key. So that's important, and we're going to keep pushing for that.
There was no justice served here today. We will fight for an appeal and answers to all the racism that my family has experienced from the day that Colton was shot until the jury delivered the verdict of not guilty.
A jury had acquitted Gerald Stanley. He's the farmer accused of killing 22-year-old Bushi. He's of the nearby Red Pheasant Cree Nation back in August 2016. The case was not clear-cut. The jury heard Bushi and his friends had been drinking and tried to steal a neighbor's vehicle before they got a flat tire and came to Stanley's farm. Stanley fired 2 warning rounds before the fatal shot, which he says went off by accident. There are concerns that all the jurors appeared white, with a white judge and a system with a long history of distrust. Prime Minister Trudeau weighed in from Los Angeles yesterday.
We have come to this point as a country far too many times. Indigenous people across this country are angry, they're heartbroken, and I know Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians alike know that we have to do better.
The Minister of Indigenous Services, Jane Philpott, went much further, suggesting the justice system had failed. She tweeted, "We all have more to do to improve justice and fairness for Indigenous Canadians." And perhaps starkest of all was this tweet from the Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould, saying, "As a country, we can and must do better." I'm joined now from Regina by Perry Bellegarde. He's National Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. So, Chief Bellegarde, you've been reaching out to the family. They're obviously upset, calling for change. How can you help them?
Again, what happened up in North Battleford, it was a legal process. It wasn't a justice process. So we're sticking and standing by the Bushi family to seek justice. And one of the things we're going to keep pushing for is real, substantive change to the overall justice system in Canada. It's not the first time it failed First Nations people. You look back over the years, you can even cite the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which cited there's problems with the justice system. You look what happened here in Saskatchewan with the frozen bodies of First Nations people outside Saskatoon, which resulted in an inquiry here back in the 90s. You look at the J.J. Harper shooting in Winnipeg, which resulted in the Manitoba inquiry. So these justice inquiries have been happening for many, many times. It's time for implementation of the recommendations. And this justice system, and as evidenced by the rallies across Canada, Canadians know it's wrong. Canadians know it's flawed. And so we've got to get down to work and fix it. And so I do call on Prime Minister to fix it and the Premiers to fix it, Scott Moe to fix this.
There are echoes here almost of the Trayvon Martin case where there was a young teenager who was killed by a fellow who felt threatened by his presence, and it really prompted the Black Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a turning point here? We've been talking forever about more justice for Indigenous people.
Again, this is nothing new for our people, but it's time for real change now.
But do you see that happening? We've got all of these ministers suggesting there's a problem
Wendy,
here.
it's starting to happen. It's good. Words are good, but we need to see real substantive change. And so that's why our job as First Nations leaders is to put pressure, political pressure, and lobby and advocate for policy changes and legislative changes so that this system gets fixed. Because the system is not working for anybody, especially for First Nations people. And Canadians see that this is wrong and it needs to be fixed.
So you've got these extraordinary statements by cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister. Are they, I don't want to say backed into a corner, but do they have to do something now with these statements?
I would encourage them to and work with them to do something now, and calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the premiers from across Canada, even in this province, Premier Scott Moe, to work together with First Nations to fix it. You have to look at the policing system. You got to look at the prosecutors. You got to look at, throw out and the peremptory obligations, of the lawyers when they select juries. Looking at more First Nations judges, even probation. It's fixing an overall system that doesn't work and looking towards a First Nations controlled justice system. That's part of the answer.
I've got one last question. There's just concerns raised by people in the legal field that by the politicians seeming to almost question the verdict, that could hamper an appeal of this verdict. Do you have any fears of that?
Well, I would hope and pray that there is no hamper, any kind of roadblocks to look at an appeal, because that's the first step to seek justice. You know, a human life was lost. A person's life was taken. And so we're not going to let Colton Bushy's life die in vain. There's got to be justice. And so we're going to look at removing all barriers and all hurdles so that there is an appeal and so that there could finally be justice for the Bushy family and for all First Nations people, because Canadians know that it's wrong. The verdict was wrong.
Well, it was quite extraordinary, particularly the reaction of the politicians this time. So we'll see what happens. Chief Bellegarde, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Wendy.
Thank you.
So I'll call forward Elder Mike Mitchell for a presentation of the Eagle Feather. Please come forward, representing East with the water drum.
So, close to 40 years ago in Akwesasne, we started our own school, a school that taught our culture, language, ceremony. I'm glad to tell you it still exists.
At this time, we're going to proceed to the side table, and Elder Mike Mitchell will read out the oath of office, which will then be hopefully agreed to by the newly re-elected National Chief.
Oath of office for a National Chief. Hear me, elders, chiefs, citizens of First Nations, as well as friends and guests here assembled. In your sight, in your hearing, I,
Perry Bellegarde,
take up the duties of National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Solemnly swear to sincerely pledge to fulfill these duties as they are outlined in the Charter, best of your abilities. Finish the rest.
I solemnly promise and sincerely pledge to place the needs of our Assembly above my own comfort. I solemnly promise and sincerely pledge to watch for all dangers and to give you warning. I solemnly promise and sincerely pledge to watch for opportunities to strengthen our peoples and to aid all such efforts. Elders, chiefs, and citizens of the First Nations, as well as friends and guests here assembled, you have heard my promises made without equivocation. I will ever call on the Great Spirit for wisdom and in help in carrying them out.
Negi jinahoda waharu, wahari wa nilo de. Sununda hata de, mahara chinyore ne sabaya diso. Tiswaga anaragwego. Jinahoda gaidan saraya. Neo hoyota. I ngwada ge natsara. Naga digiga ke holosagane hawahawana nodu. Wagare. I ngwana agatse. Eto dekra. Jinahoda gayad. Say it in Cree now.
Nyalgoa.
So while they're signing, I'm going to call forward the Saskatchewan drum to do a song representing the South.
They were shaking us in my hand.
At this time, in honor of where we are today in the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, it is my honor to call upon Musqueam Elder Thelma Stogan to do a cedar cleansing of our newly re-elected National Chief. So at this time, he'll be, we'll have the blanketing and the new moccasins, followed by the looks like it's a Squamish family of drummers. Thank you so much, Joshua. Joseph has found some relatives and members of his community to join him. The Squamish Nation Singers will be singing a song after the presentation of the blanket. Join me in welcoming to the podium the newly re-elected National Chief, Perry Bellegarde.
Ista kakeo nuako magnak. Nista kanaskum tinawao. No tainan semanito kanaskum tin. My friends and relatives, thanking you all, kanaskum tinawao, acknowledging Creator, kind, loving God, no tawinan, give thanks. As well, we give thanks to these people back here. I want to acknowledge and give thanks, of course, first and foremost, to the Creator. But we can't do anything as individuals without a good team. And I want to lift up and thank my nominator and seconder for their confidence and trust, Chief Patricia, Chief Cookby Ron, for standing with me. They're a strong team. I just want to applaud them. I also want to thank a person that has won many, many things in her life. And we say that old saying, behind every man there's a good woman, but that's an old saying. I don't think my partner Val would ever say that. And I want to bring her here because this is the lady. She's from the Nipissing First Nation. And her writing and her style and her strategy, that closing the gap document that I always refer to, she wrote it. So I want to thank her for her work and the support and for her comradeship and her partnership. Citizens of all our nations and tribes, this part is done now. We have work to do. To my colleagues on the executive, all the 10 regional chiefs, I acknowledge you and lift you up because we have work to do together. Just one person here can't do anything alone. So we need your strength. I see some of them here, Chief Hart, Chief TG, all the chiefs that are here on the executive. I thank them and acknowledge them. This is a humbling experience. It's a great experience. And why we let ourselves serve. It's public service. And no matter what level we are at, no matter where we are, whether it's on council at the reserve, or the tribal council, or treaty areas, or PTOs, or national organizations, I've said this before, that we're trying to make a difference for our people. And as a leader, or as a person, or a helper or a servant, that's all we are. We might have these terms or these names like chiefs or grand chiefs, but if you're taught by the elders, we are servants and helpers of the people. And so we keep that in mind here on this date, in these lands. The only points I want to say now, because you've been sitting a long time, there's these two things I'll say will always guide us. It's this worldview. Our worldview as Indigenous peoples. That's a very important piece. But in my travels across Canada, seeking this position, listening to elders and youth and chiefs and councils in every community and territory, there's one thing that kept coming up. There's one thing that always kept recurring, a discussion and dialogue about this thing. And this thing was, how do we now, as Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, move beyond these two things that have created havoc in our lives? How do we move beyond the genocide of that residential school system now? How do we move beyond that? And how do we move beyond the colonization of that Indian Act and exert ourselves as nations? And last year when we talked about this thing called Canada's 150, everywhere we went, Indigenous people said, why are we celebrating as Indigenous peoples? And we say it this way, we're not celebrating, but we're going to participate. Because they've said it this way, that after all those things, that genocide of that residential school, that termination of our beautiful languages and cutting of our long hair and everything made to feel bad, we're still here as First Nations people, and we're proud, and our languages are getting stronger, and our ceremonies are getting stronger. And it's that it's the next 150 years that chapter about Canada's history will be written. And when I see our young people hanging on to their language in their ceremonies, there's bright hope for that next 150 years. There's bright light when our little ones are going to pick up that torch and move forward. And that's what I see in this last tour here in Canada, about moving beyond the next 150 years to build a better country for all of us. And this gap will be closed. This gap will be closed. Better housing, better education, better health care, and yes, lands and resources coming back to First Nations people, because we know it's assumed Crown sovereignty. We know it's assumed Crown jurisdiction, and we're going to get that back in our rightful place in this land. That's what I see. That's my vision, that's my hope, and we need to work together to do that. My last point, friends and relatives. If we can adopt our Indigenous worldview, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally, we'll create a better world and a better society. And what I'm going to talk about is this. We are the two-leggeds. And I always say this, and elders will say, what do you mean? We don't see color in a way. Black people, white people, red people, yellow people. We're the two-leggeds. And when we go to ceremony, our old people always advise us and caution us to show respect for the Creator, the main one. But we also take time to acknowledge the one that sits in the east, in the south, in the west, in the north. We take time to acknowledge all we get from Mother Earth. She sustains us. We acknowledge Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun. We acknowledge our relatives, the star people. We acknowledge the male plants, the female plants. And we acknowledge our relatives, the four-legged ones. The ones that fly, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl. We're part of that as a family. But most important, there are four grandmothers that look after the waters. The rainwater, the salt water, the fresh water. And when life comes, water breaks. That's the four grandmothers. So if that worldview can be adopted, we'll always find a balance between the economy and the environment. We'll always find that balance to protect the land and the waters. We'll always find that to build a better country and a better world, because we're the two-leggeds. And we all need clean air and clean water. And we need to keep remembering that worldview. And as we go forward now, as our Assembly of First Nations, let that worldview guide us. Let that worldview resonate not only here in Canada but throughout the world, because our elders have so much to offer this world. And so now, my friends, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you in a very big way for the trust and confidence for another term. We have work to do. Let's keep our circle strong and make our A.F.N. the best it can be in this country for the sake of our children, those yet unborn. Egose, que nas continuau. Hi, hi.
Let me be an individual, free to travel, free to work, free to follow my own means, knowledge, past, present. I am only one that I want to be. I can't be everything, but I can be something. What I can do, what I ought to do.
National Chief, thanks so much for taking some time for us. What good came out of 2018 for First Nations people?
Good question. When you think back to 2018 and what happened for First Nations people in a positive way, I think back to a number of things. First thing is the amount of investment in First Nations issues. $17 billion over 7 fiscal years, for education and housing and infrastructure and water. That's an unprecedented amount. So we've got to make sure that those resources get out to the communities and that they have a real meaningful impact on the ground. So that's one of the big things. I also think about NAFTA, pushing for an Indigenous peoples chapter throughout NAFTA. And now there is a Canada-USA-Mexico agreement, and by far, when you look at it, it's the most progressive as it relates to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' rights. That's another big thing. Another big thing is getting government convinced that they've got to co-develop legislation with us as First Nations peoples. So we're beginning the process on Indigenous Languages Act. We're beginning the process on the child welfare piece of legislation. So those are positive developments. But we've got to keep building and doing more because there's still a huge socioeconomic gap that exists. And we have to close that, because once that gap closes, it's not only good for First Nations people, it's good for Canada as a whole. So we have lots of work to do.
National Chief, would you say there were some step backs from reconciliation in 2018?
Well, when you think of it across Canada, there's a few setbacks we wish we could have moved on a lot quicker. When I think about the justice system and starting to move towards restorative justice versus punitive justice, I think about the issues with policing in Quebec, the Sûreté de Québec. I think about the issue of policing in Thunder Bay. I think about all those things, and I think we have to really collaboratively and collectively work together to start working towards a First Nations justice system. And we need more First Nations police officers, First Nations court workers, First Nations juries and judges, and all the above. It's about a whole justice system that needs to be revamped. And that's what we got to put our energies going forward. And I think we can do that.
You've spoken about having 3 priorities ahead of the October 2019 federal election. What work do you need to get done?
Oh, there's a lot of work. We got to make sure that all of our priorities get into every major party platform, from the Liberals to the Conservatives to the NDP to the Greens. We have to advocate so that we see ourselves and our priorities and our issues reflected in their party platforms. As First Nations people, we've said we need a new fiscal relationship with the Crown. One that's based on total membership, on and off our communities, one that keeps up with inflation, one that's treaty-based, and even a percentage of GDP from the land and resource wealth, which we're sharing. That's a new fiscal relationship with the Crown we need. We need to work towards treaty implementation. We have a treaty with the Crown, and treaty will always trump policy. And so no matter who gets in, our relationships with the Crown and the honor of the Crown must be respected. We've got to fix 4 outdated policies: comprehensive claims, specific claims, additions to reserve, the inherent right to self-government are all currently based on termination of rights and title, not recognition of rights and title. So we've got to work on those pieces. So there's a lot of work going forward. And I think we can get this done. And if we get this done in a good way, you're going to have a better country for everybody.
National Chief, I appreciate you taking some time for us.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.